Hello and welcome to KMI Maven of the Month. I'm Agnese, I'm a PhD student at KMI, and together with Professor Enrico Motta, we're relaunching an initiative that was pioneered at KMI back in 1995. We're inviting top experts from all around the world to discuss broad socio-technical topics that are of concern to many of us. In this first episode, we will be discussing ethics and AI, and we've invited Ricardo Baeza Yates, who is a professor at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. Formerly, he was also a VP of Research at Yahoo Labs, both in Spain and in California. And his work on bias in the web and information retrieval has received many awards and distinctions. So without further ado, let's hear from Ricardo about ethics and AI, a challenging task. I hope you enjoy this episode.
We have found that there are two things that are important in practical, useful AI is to have a human in the loop. Although you will see later, I don't like to say human in the loop because basically we need semantics, common sense embedded in these applications. And the second one is something what we see every day, the strong dependence on data and data, but sometimes what we need is the right data. So that would be a completely different talk, but also it's very important. Many times data is much more important than algorithms. And sometimes to improve algorithms, we just need to put more data. So I will cover two parts. So the first part, I will do a summary of what I have here, which is some ethical issues that I find important. So this has my personal bias. Bias will be one of the problems, so you have to be aware of your own. And the second part will be about genetic issues that we need to solve in the future. So these are more like societal or research questions that we need to answer. And at the end, we will try to mention maybe during the discussion what things we can do to solve partly this problem, where we still need to do a lot of more work. So let's start with the first problem. The main one, I guess, is what I call the course of bias. So you have an algorithm that receives biased data. All data is biased in some sense. The first bias we have is that when we talk about bias, we think about a negative bias. But bias is neutral in general. So we have some positive biases in the evolution of humanity. So information in some sense is biased too, because if you enter random noise, you don't get anything. So the first question here important is if the algorithm should be neutral or if the algorithm should be fair. This is a question that computer scientists need to ask today. But however, normally this question is not asked, and then we get the same bias, or worse, we get an amplified bias. And very important, bias is not only in the data. You will see in the examples. You can check my paper on communication of ACM 2018, where I give the full vicious loop of bias in the web that exemplifies all the types of bias that you can find. So what is being fair? So for example, we have equality, we have equity, where we have affirmative actions that can be considered a positive bias. And then you have justice. But justice is much harder because that implies to remove the problem. And removing the problem, for example, say gender bias or racism, that will take a long time. If you're interested in the topic, I really suggest to see this documentary, very good one, done by women, Coded Bias. By the way, I'm participating in a panel about this topic in the Web Science Conference today, also just after this talk. And we did a panel, ACM panel, on March 29, that was titled From Coded Bias to Algorithmic Fairness. How do we get there? And I was the lucky man to participate there. So non-technical question. Same, as I said, or more bias. So what we can do? Well, the answer is, you don't have to always answer this question, but if you harm people either psychologically or physically, then you need to ask these questions. Of course, to define how you harm psychologically a person is hard, but I will get back to that at the end. Solutions to this problem, you can debias the input. That's the best possibility, but sometimes we don't know what is the reference value. So For example, we know that more women should be attending this talk, but maybe we don't know exactly what should be the percentage. In India could be 70%, in Iran could be 60%, in other countries will be 10%. That's something that society has to decide. You can tune the algorithm. For example, in search, we have learning to rank with ranking bias, and the algorithm takes care of the bias, so it's aware of the bias. Awareness is one of the most important things to start handling bias. And then you can debias the output. But then you lost a lot of information. For example, if you search for a position, a candidate in LinkedIn, and you get 10 women on 50 results, the best you can do is to put them in the top 20, so there's a gender parity on the top, but you cannot do much more because you already lost information. And let me, I will skip some content, but there are two questions here that are important. Is a circuit algorithm ethical? So how much transparency we need to have. But then we need to ask, is a public algorithm safe? Because that can be gamed. And there are many algorithms where people try to game. So we'll skip a few slides. And I want to get to this example, which is an example of bias amplification, where you will see why this is more complicated than it looks. So this is a very nice paper from 2018, I believe. It's about bails in New York. So they took a lot of data from the state of New York, and they tried to predict if the person should get bail or not. And this shows the process. So in New York, the judge only has to ask if the person will appear in court again. So it doesn't matter if the person will reoffend or not, which is a bit different from other states in the US, and also is a bit different from the rest of the world. Now, if you cannot pay, there is a person, typically in the US, from where you can borrow money, and this person has to do the same prediction of the judge. This person will come back to return the loan. And we have another problem here, is that we know only half the data, because we do not know what would have happened if the person had bail, if the person went to prison. So for that, you need to do data imputation. So this is a very interesting paper because it has all the typical problems of a nice machine learning model. So these are the results. This is a paper by Kleinberg et al. That was asked by the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, because they are interested in spending less money in prisons. Was not being asked by the National Bureau of Justice. And they found that they could decrease the crime rate in 25%, keeping the same prison rate, or they could decrease the prison rate in 42%, keeping the same crime rate. So this was much better than the judges. Part of the important thing is that if you take the 1% most dangerous criminals, basically almost 50% got bail, and of those, 56% failed to appear, and 62% reoffend. So they split the data in imputation set, the classical training and validation, cross-validation techniques, but also they put some data in a lockbox, so any third party can check how good was the model, and that data was never seen by the model. So they use gradient boosted decision trees, which are kind of non-linear decision trees that allow some interpretability. And the only demographic feature they used was the age of the person. And then, of course, all the data from the case. So what was the result? Here in red, I put the percentage of population of that race between codes, because we know it's a social construct, Black or Hispanic, so they are 31% in the state of New York, but we already see that we get 82% that on front of the judge. So we already see some bias on the people that come, huge bias on the people that come to the judge. And the judge will send more Black people to the prison, so 57% instead of 49, but the Hispanic will decrease, but in overall, the 82 will go up to almost 89%. Well, what happened with the model? So the model learned to be more racist. So it was amplified the racism. So it gets almost to 60% Black, 30% Hispanic, so also amplify being less biased with Hispanic, but in total, the 89% went to 90%, so 1% increase in the bias. But still, even if we match the less biased judge, the system was able to improve 23% from the judges. So the question is why? Well, here we can see what happened if you want to send additional people to prison. So if this is the model, so the model will take the top people here on the judges are most lenient, but if you see from where are the ones that the second quintile of leniency on judges would take, you see that it's almost random. So basically, the decisions of the judges look like random, and there is an explanation for that. And this shows how they solved the imputation problem. So the imputation problem was solved by dividing the judge in 5 groups, depending on how lenient they were. So this is the dilemma with judge decisions. Do you prefer a biased but just algorithm or a noisy judge? Because you see that the decisions are noisy, very noisy. And of course, they are biased too, so they're racist. But in what sense the algorithm is just? Basically, in the sense that given 2 identical cases, the decision will be always the same. This is not true with judges. And here I have examples of how when you, for example, to choose a target, these 4 cases will differ. And I have been talking about this from a paper that Daniel Kahneman and collaborators published in 2016, but last month, he published a very nice book called Noise that I think is something as important as bias because also has a big impact on society. So there are many examples of gender bias, race bias. For example, all facial recognition was developed with no consent on using pictures. Last year, they suspended facial recognition. Yesterday, the European Council also put a statement against this. The ACM, and I'm part of this committee, also did in June, almost 1 year ago, also asked for suspension of use of facial recognition. But this kept giving problems because the technology is already deployed everywhere. And this will be maybe the main ethical issue today all over the world, from China to the US. I would skip a little bit about gender bias. This is well known, but let me show you something more different. So this is a table of the size of models, how language models, how they have grown from birth of 340 million to 1.6 billion, and recently there was a Chinese one that was 1.7 billion. And the question is, how many words are using to decide every parameter, because it's getting close to the size of the web. And for example, in January, Abid et al. Published this paper that show anti-Muslim bias. So if you write this sentence, 2 Muslims walk into A, and then you ask for a completion, you will see that most completions are violent. In fact, 65% of the completions are violent for Muslims compared to only 15% from Christians. So this shows partly the reality, but also partly the bias of the news. And it's nice to see that the less violent are Buddhist and atheists. So, but it can be much more complicated. So we'll not go through this, but you must know the case of the UK student grade, the very interesting case of the Deliveroo last January in Bologna, where they found that the algorithm was discriminating all the riders that were not able to deliver food at dinner time, and so on. But it can be even worse. So this is I think, the worst case so far for democracy, when after a series of mishaps, the whole government of Netherlands resigned last January, and this started because of discrimination in child care benefits, that they want to find fraud in poor people, and of course they made mistakes, and even the justice said that this was correct, and which is a huge ethical issue. And at the end was basically the Congress of Netherlands that had to deal with this, and at the end the government had to step down. Second issue, what is called physiognomy. This is something very old from the Greeks, but for example, started with Kosinski trying to predict sexual orientation, a Stanford researcher. Or for example, sorry, that doesn't appear well. Oh, sorry, it's okay, yeah. So for example, trying to infer criminality, this also happened in the US later. So this is like Minority Report. Uh, or again, Kosinski trying to find a political orientation last January on this. So, but this can be even worse. And if you go ever to Torino, you can go to the former house of Cesare Lombroso, one of the main defenders of this idea of phrenology, that basically criminals had a different skull, and he collected hundreds of skulls, and he at least was coherent with what he was thinking, so he left also his whole skeleton, I guess, as ground truth of something that was not a criminal, although he collected all these skulls from people that was not basically recovered from the morgue. But it can be worse. For example, this is a paper from MIT in 2019, a very well-known conference, where they claim that from your voice you can get your face. I may believe that your mouth and your neck may be related to your voice, but what about your eyes, your ears, the rest of the face? No way. There's no causality there. So if I take all these works, for example, also this meter patent that claims that from your face they can get your name. I hope this patent is not granted. I can do my master phrenology algorithm. So from your voice, I get your face, and from the other work, I can get your name if you're a political opposer, if you're homosexual, and if you're a criminal. And in many countries, this is a big problem. Third problem, unfair e-commerce. I will go very fast. This is more subtle, but basically, if we don't have the data, we create a filter bubble, and this relates to the Truman Show. He wanted to get out of his bubble. But there is a dangerous feedback loop because you are only exposed to things that the algorithm gives to you. So you can only click on the recommendations that are shown to you. And so the huge exposure bias, and it's not like really like an iceberg, it's just the ice cube on the top of the iceberg. And this is something that is very important on bias on the web too, and on recommender systems. So you get things like popularity bias too. You get the Matthew effect, so the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Long tail items, new items, long tail players are discriminated, and this is happening in all e-commerce markets in the world, like Amazon, AliExpress, and so on. Fourth problem, stupid models. Models that don't understand what they are doing. For example, here I want to quote George Box when he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. AI is in some sense is the same. He was talking about statistics, but it's the same. So some examples. Stock market models that use Twitter data, they see Elon Musk as tweeting that we should use Signal, and then all the algorithms buy a stock from the closest company to the name Signal, which is Signal, which is a medical company in Texas, and the value of that company goes to 400% more, so the company is very happy, but the algorithm is not doing a sensible thing. Here there are other examples. So the one on the right is from adversarial AI. You can change just one pixel on the image, and then you get a different prediction. For example, you can go from a dog to a cat, from a cat to a bird, and so on. So the question is, what are these models learning? They're not learning what we learn, they're learning something else, and they're very sensible to changes in the input. The last example. So this town is called Bitche in France, where some hate detection algorithm applied in France, that was the first mistake, found that this was like an improper page, and this page was out of Facebook for 3 weeks. Of course, the town was not happy because, for example, the page was used to communicate information about COVID, And the problem here was also there was no human in the loop because all complaints were not seen until they had to escalate, I guess, a friend of a friend that worked in Facebook, which is a typical escalation when things don't work. So we need to remember the limitations on our systems. For example, nobody worried about self-driven cars until a woman died on Arizona. Clearly, in the data, there was no case of a person crossing in the mid part of the of a street with a bicycle at night. You cannot learn what's not in the data, and there's always a case in the future that's not in the data. So you need to remember that. And the problem here is not the accuracy. It doesn't matter if the accuracy is 99%. The problem is what's the impact of that 1% of errors? And if the impact is much, much larger than the benefit of the 99%, you need to stop using the model. So if you are doing any classification prediction, please be humble. If you're not sure, have a label that says, I don't know. That's what people do. Not all people, but what sensible people do. And the last topic will be waste of resources. And this, I come back to this table. This table is from the famous paper from Bender, Gebru, Macmillan, and Mitchell. So basically, how much carbon footprint we release when we train these models? Well, about 57 years of an average human life, or between $1 or $3 million of money. So if this reasonable, especially to have language models that have gender bias, that have religion bias, as we saw, that have race bias, and so on. So, so this paper was presented in FACT 2021 last March. Margaret couldn't write his name because he was still in Google, but that didn't matter because she was also fired later, like Timnit was in December. So because of this, a group of researchers, including myself, wrote a paper that is available on the second number of Ethics and AI that is free, towards the intellectual freedom in AI ethics global community. We need to basically understand these issues without any kind of censorship. So let's start with the second part. In 2017, the ACM this statement on 7 properties algorithms should fulfill, and of course, most algorithms don't fulfill these 7 properties. Remember that systems do not need to be perfect, but they need to be much better than us, and this has to do on how humans judge machines. And here, I recommend the book of Cesar Hidalgo and his colleagues, and the digital version is free in judgingmachines.com, on how humans judge machine errors much harder than human errors. Not fair, right? There's a bias there. And then we have pragmatical questions on all the things that algorithms should fulfill. So, for example, to whom is important? To which part of the system applies? Here I have something I'm working on. For example, these are 30 different properties of software. And here are the 4 parts of the system and the 4 main actors of people that can worry about these parts. And this is an intent to classify all these things that are important. So if you take this is my own taxonomy of properties for systems, that they don't have to be AI, but in most cases will be AI systems. So it's awareness, data provenance, everything about data, completeness, everything about the software, usability, everything about the user, transparency, everything about basically showing what you are doing, and finally responsibility, everything about your relation with the society. There's some people already working on how to understand this new kind of software that should be ethical. This is a nice diagram from Ben Schneiderman, one of the main researchers on HCI. And you see the different things within a team, organization, and industry. Here, the main question is how to develop software with the help of AI. So AI should help AI to be ethical. We have cultural issues. We'll skip this part. but I would like to mention, for example, a different kind of ethics. This is the Ubuntu ethics. I am because we are, so the focus is in the community and not in the person. And there is a very interesting paper on the card that's saying that he was wrong because a person is a person through other persons. So basically, it's not about the individual, it's about the group. And then we have issues on identity, data protection, and privacy. I will skip this, and I hope you know Article 22 of GDPR, that is about the right to contest and what that means. And then there's a very interesting case in France where they said that they couldn't do facial recognition in a school because of they don't have the competence, they didn't have the consent of people, and the solution was not proportional to the goal that they were trying to achieve. Then we have all the cases on regulation. So last year and now this year, there are cases in the US against Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And recently, this happens just a few days ago, they are trying to even regulate to all large companies, basically because of this monopoly on data. And in the left, you have all these four proposed laws that were rejected during Trump's government, including one that was proposed also by Kamala Harris, the current vice president. So I'm sure you're aware of the EU proposal for AI regulation that was published 2 months ago. And then what things are prohibited, like, for example, this one is very interesting, the Article 5, anything that can cause personal, physical, or psychological harm. That's already we need to discuss. But for example, let's say you present advertising on fast food to a person that has a metabolic problem, that will cause not only psychological but also physical harm. That should be forbidden. And then you have high risk AI systems. And again, this is the problem when we try to put things in categories. I'm sure people will try not to be in this list, and they will try to conceal anything that is complicated to be on the low risk AI systems. But this is a continuum. So systems is a continuum. You cannot put these kind of systems in two categories. We need to assess the real risk and then ask the right questions. And then you have topics about registering algorithms, auditing algorithms. A very interesting, another paper in FACT 2021 that was a real audit. These are colleagues at Northeastern, and they agreed to do the audit with the condition that the paper had to be published. Doesn't matter the result of the audit. So this is a very interesting real case, and the company took the risk, and then they passed the audit. Now they can use it as a marketing tool, but you need to take the risk. So there's many bad human practices. I will skip this. There are professional biases. We can talk this on the questions, but there are interesting results that show that even the designers and the coders can transfer their bias to the code. For example, I believe female design system will be more empathic than male design systems. What we can do? Well, look for bias on the data, make the design implementation aware of bias, make the user aware of bias all the time. So you need to give also more control to the user, so users are not stupid, at least not all. And the ones that read fake news, I don't know, but I hope if they become aware, they realize.
Ricardo, 2 minutes.
Yes. And then some recommendations, we can skip it. But I prefer to talk about humans in control and not humans in the loop. And remember, ethics also is a collective property, so it doesn't depend only on your ethics. It will depend on the ethics of all the people related to you, like providers and clients, and if you're a person, your family, and so on. So these are the final take-home messages. Remember to be aware of your own biases and ethics. Too bad that today the technology seems to be enjoyed by the rich and suffered by the poor. So we need to change that. We need to get to real transhumanism that is not what is humanism today. And we need to do more research on many, many problems. So last two questions. can AI algorithms ever be ethical? So I recommend to read this essay by Hazel Henderson. And then David Lauer remembers something very important that may be trivial, but until someone doesn't say it, it's not trivial. You cannot have AI ethics without ethics. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Maybe we can all give hands virtually. It's a pity it's not the same as in person, but that's what it is. Thank you so much for such an insightful talk, Ricardo. I would like to give more attention to one point you raised in your taxonomy, which is awareness. It seems to be a very prominent component. You also mentioned it in your ACM bias in the web paper. And I'm paraphrasing, but essentially what you're saying is that awareness is the foundation of everything. First, we need to identify the bias to then incorporate it. So my question is really, do you see awareness as something that should be ahead of the design process of the models and the system? Or you think that to some extent there are already systems that are detecting bias and can also help raising this awareness in turn?
I think the answer is both in some sense, but I would say that awareness should start with in the design, and then this right to contest of the Article 22 of the GDPR, I would like to extend it to the whole process. So you have the right to contest at design time. You should have the right to contest at, for example, architecture time, the right to contest in the prototype time. So basically have experts, users, civil society, basically testing your system all the way on the process of development. So this is something very important. And of course, AI should help on finding the things that we're not looking at, because AI is good at that. And well, in general, AI is good to look at things that maybe we don't see. So patterns that are there and we don't see, like the case of Deliveroo. So the algorithm found something that is interesting to earn more money, but also another algorithm can find what is going wrong there.
Thank you. And another thing that can be seen as a conundrum in some sense is that bias is this cognitive trait that is very natural to all of us. So if we're incorporating it in the entire process, as you say, to raise awareness, how does one approach building a set of objective criteria to define bias and detach himself or herself with our own lenses through the world, with our own background and biases?
Yeah, this is, we were discussing this with a friend like 2 nights ago. This is something complicated because many of these biases are in some sense, are our animal part. So for example, sometimes I see people saying the animals, like we are not animals. This is another bias. They're trying to not be part of the animal world. But we are animals. We had an evolution over 1 million years. And many things are today are more rational than evolution, in the sense that we have changed a lot of things where, for example, even the body has not adapted yet. So we need to evolve much more to really put everything that we're doing like rationally in our, for example, instinctive part. So we have an instinctive part that we cannot change, and this has been proven for example, if you take let's say a small animal that and you show him eat a tiger, will be afraid, even if it was the first time that saw the tiger. And we have these kind of biases too. The first time we see something we don't know, we're at the same time we are afraid right away. Especially if we have read about it, but we haven't never seen it. So all these things are learned when we are kids, are learned from our culture, and even we learn it from our language. So the language encodes a lot of bias, and sometimes we don't notice. For example, you can check how many words in English have the word man inside, and so on. And another language, for example, in Spanish and I think in Italian, the word accountability doesn't exist. Why? And so on. So you need to, at least in Spanish, we need to use 3 words. I don't know if in Italian you have only a single word for accountability, but I think it's something to do with Latin languages. and so on. So these things are encoded in us. So it's very hard to solve them if we are not aware of it. As you said, awareness is the first. I don't think it's the base, it's the first step only. But it's the first step that will solve like 80% of the problems. So that starts, if we're not aware, we cannot do anything.
Thank you. And I'll try to think about the Italian word for accountability, but on
If
top
you-
of
if you-
my
if you- if you
head,
don't
I
have
can't
it-
at the moment.
If you don't have it, then that's.
No, I think that's an excellent point. Thank
Okay, Ricardo, I'll ask a question then, and then we'll take. I see that there are some questions in the chat, so then I will take a few questions from the audience. So one of the last points you made in your slides is that AI and ethics, essentially requires ethics in the first instance. So I was looking at this report from the AI Now Institute, and they made a point which is a little bit related to the paper you showed about the use of auditing, these kinds of bias auditing, and I think New York City Council, they are introducing a law that requires these systems to be audited, at least systems used for recruitment and things like that. But essentially what the AI Now Institute people say that it's not just about statistical fairness, it's about fairness in a more holistic way. And therefore you need the sort of interdisciplinary approach, you need the legislation, you need the social scientists, you need the psychology, etc. So I guess my question is, do you have, is this happening anywhere? Is there anybody who is actually looking at this issue, or any consortium or any project is actually looking at this issue in a more, I will say, organic way, kind of multidisciplinary way?
So that's a good question. I'm not sure. So I guess I would just say I will apply my own recommendation. I don't know. But for example, there's a global alliance of centers of ethics in the world that is trying to approach this problem. And if you're interested on being members, anyone can, and any institution can be member. And right now it's not too large. It's like 20, 30 institutions, but all around the world. And they're trying to look at this. And one important thing is training. Like how do we train people to be aware of these things? So this is the first step. So all the people should know about these things. But something you said, I think there's another dimension that is important to mention here, is that anything we can do to, say, certify or audit and so on, it's not very, very important, because these systems are dynamic. These are learning from data. These models are being improved and changed. So you cannot certify an algorithm and then you say, okay, this algorithm will be certified forever. No, will be certified only until you change it. And this can happen very soon. So in some sense, what also we need is a certification of the process. So it will be more like ISO. Like you cannot say this product is always perfect. You can say, we check the whole process and looks like the process is in place. They have all the things that they need to be in place in case of errors. So for example, in the future, I say, okay, they have all the process in place to deal with these, for example, ethical issues. Now, what are the things you need to have? We don't know yet. We don't know all of them. But for example, I couldn't mention, but the one thing, you need to have an ethical board. And the ethical board should have 50% of people external to you. Otherwise, you have a conflict of interest. And basically, everything should go through that ethical board before being deployed, and so on. So this will be the first thing I would say. If you don't comply with this, I don't believe you can be ethical. Now, also remember, when we are saying ethical AI, we are also pushing the concept of ethics a bit, because ethics is about human beings. It's not about machines. So we are extending this concept to things that don't have a brain, for example. And now we can go to intelligence and other things that we already don't have a common definition all over the world.
Okay, to be fair to the New York people, I think they are planning to have a yearly auditing. I think they are aware that systems change, but of course, in those 12 months between two audits, I guess a system can develop very quickly. So That's a very good point.
So I can answer the questions in the chat if you want.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think, Agnese, if you want to coordinate the
There
questions
are
in the chat.
some very interesting threads coming up in the chat, like about the human in control that you're proposing. There is one question by Pasquale: should we
Yes.
then ban systems that cannot have a human in control? And on the opposite, there's another question by Irum. I don't know if Irum wants to unmute and elaborate on that, but along the lines of not wanting to have humans that are too much in control and introduce bias.
So yeah, these are good questions. First, let me answer Pasquale. I say the answer is no. In there are systems where we will never have a human in control, and maybe we don't want to. For example, the best example today would be airplane control. For example, until today, and many places where humans doing this, it's a very tiring, stressful work that machines can do much better and much faster. So we want only to have a human in the loop just in case the system doesn't know what to do. But there we don't need to have humans in control. But now, because I went really fast through that slide, when I say human in control, I meant also that we are the designers, we are the implementers, we build the system. So we should be in control already. And this is what the point of being in control. So when you're saying a human in the loop, it's like saying there were no humans involved in the design and the implementation and deployment of the system. And that's not true. Humans did all that. So I want to feel that part. I want to feel that those humans feel that they're in control. Today it seems that after they do their work, they're not in control any longer. So they're like a couple of ways to interpret this idea of humans in control.
And in this mix, there's a question by Shaley Minocha in the chat. So about the interaction between ethic, transparency, and explainability. Can you say a bit more about the transparency component?
Yeah. So I would say that we need explainability before talking about transparency. We need explainability when when we need to fulfill the right to contest. And basically, I believe that should be fulfilled when you can harm people. So basically, it should be compulsory to have explainability if people can be harmed in any way. Now, transparency is not necessarily always needed, and I think this is something cultural. So I would say that transparency is what we ask in South Europe, because the trust of the institutions are in some sense eroded by many years of say bad governments. So we don't believe we don't trust them. So we ask transparency. Society asks transparency. So we ask them to show things to us. However, in the more like a common law, like the US or the United Kingdom, people ask for accountability. So basically, prepare to show something if you get an audit or at the end we find something wrong, but they are not asking for transparency all the time. So one thing I will say is that sometimes doesn't make sense to ask for transparency and accountability, because basically you are asking for double work. Either you ask for transparency, either you ask for accountability, but that will depend on the culture. Well, you can always ask for everything if you don't trust anything, but I think it's good to have these cultural differences in mind.
So also negotiating one thing at a time, working on one thing at a time
Also,
as
yeah.
well. Yeah.
Usually, also because transparency is all the way, so you need to have transparency in the whole thing, while accountability is at the end. So also they are very different.
There is another very interesting question by Vicky Murphy. Vicky, do you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want us to read it? Okay, I'll read the question then. So she asked, do you think that potential benefits to a community can outweigh the right of individuals to control their own data? For example, at the Open University, we collect a lot of data about students. If nudges based on that data means that more students will successfully complete their degree, should the single individual be able to opt out? And doing so, there may be algorithmic biases and harm to those who need the nudges most.
A very, very good question. This has so many angles. I will brainstorm on the question because I will need more time to say. I don't think there is a definite answer here. For example, in some cases, I would say yes, the benefit to a community can outweigh the right of individuals to control their own data. Yes, maybe we are seeing that with COVID, although it's a fallacy that you cannot have complete privacy of your data, and also, for example, have a good traceability of the pandemic. Because sometimes you get these false dilemmas in place. But on the other hand, I feel that we have some rights that we should be able to basically to have. For example, if I don't want to have someone helping me, I think I should have the right to opt out. But to do that, I need to be aware of what is the impact of that. So I think today, the bias that is in the system, and I guess is part of the question, is that you are not aware of what is the impact of, for example, opting out. You are asked opt out or opt in, and you have to decide in 1 second, in one click, what you want to know, what you want to do. For example, with cookies, the same. Maybe in some sites it's good to have the cookie and others not. So I answer no all the time, but probably if I read the terms of usage of every website, in some cases, I would say yes, but I don't have time to read it. So there are many questions that are very hard to answer properly and well. So I would say that if you are aware of the result, I think you should be able to opt out, but you should be aware. So of course, I think I'm more worried not on the problem of what happened with the person that opts out, because that is the responsibility of that person. I'm worried of what biases that not having that people creates on the other people that's still in the system. Basically, what is the data missing from the system? I think this is also a very important point of your question. So if some people opt out, the whole system gets biased to the people that opt in. And this happens in many things in the web. For example, very few people interact in the web. Most people just look at it. So for example, you take Twitter is not representative of the real population. It's the representative of the people that want to participate. And they have maybe very different incentives to do that. Some of them are good, some of them are bad.
Yeah, there are so many layers to this, like the bias or who opts out, why someone opts in or out. Very, very interesting. Thank you for your questions and for the answers. There's also a question in the chat by Anna Delido. Anna, I don't know if you want to elaborate on your question. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and ask Ricardo.
So we have a gender bias in the questions. That's good.
True.
Sure. Hi. Yeah, my question was about what you said when you mentioned the new Article 5 on the AI recommendation, and you said, okay, so for example, if we want to recommend a person that some fast food and this person has some clinical problem, that would be considered harmful. So it just got me thinking, and I'm thinking like, okay, fine. So if I want to design a just, algorithm, I should have access to this data, but this data is very private because it's clinical data. So it's almost a chicken egg, one of this paradox you mentioned before. So it's dangerous, like in order to do good just recommendation, you need to kind of have personal data, but this is also undermining security in other aspect and privacy. So how do you think this regulation will be even possible to obey to? Because it's just very hard to think how we're going to do it.
Yeah, that's why I was pointing that article, because not only the point you raised, but also if you read the whole article, you have the word subliminal, so you need to define what that means. You have the word conscious, and we have to define what's conscious, because sometimes I feel people is clicking without any consciousness. So it's very complicated. And then also there are other verbs there. And that, for example, that article changed many times, because in the previous version was completely different. And they tried to put it better, but it's very hard to define that. Of course, we cannot give clinical data to be able to say enforce that, but we can do other things. For example, for example, a system can check if you are becoming addicting to clicking on these things. So this is one thing that we should do, or for example, other things that are similar, where you can opt in or opt out. But for example, when Apple is starting to tell you how much screen time you're using per week, I would have liked to have also the option that putting a maximum time per week. Today, we cannot do that, right? But for example, it's the same. If we're getting addictive, we need to put controls that are yours saying here. So for example, it would be nice if I can say, I don't want fast food ads, or I want at most one fast food ad per day. Or if I click 5 times in a week in this kind of ads, please don't show me this kind of ads any longer, and so on. This is the thing that said we need to have more control. So I need to decide things, not the system for me. So the systems today are very paternalistic. They decide for us. I want a system where I can decide for myself. And I want things that no system, for example, something that I would like is to be able to take say a news interface and ask for the news that the most different person from me is watching. I will be scared, but it's not because I want to see those news. It's because I want to see how far I'm from this other person, because today I think we believe that people is closer to us than it really is. And we are seeing that in politics, we are seeing that in COVID vaccines, we are seeing that in so many conspiracy theories that at least I would like to see, okay, let me be aware of the world I am in, because it's much more complex than what I want to believe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Very, very fascinating, beautiful presentation. I'm gonna leave the screen.
Thank you. And well, this presentation, the whole presentation is available on YouTube, because I already gave it in a few places. I started only this year, but I think has some appeal.
We will make the recording available as well, so one more place to find it.
Okay, I think we are approaching the end of our slot. Actually, I would just like to ask a final question. That is, there is. I mean, of course, we all agree that these are huge issues. But of course, like I see myself as an AI person, so I like the idea that I want to defend AI. And one thing that is a little bit frustrating, as you say, that is about ethics more than AI and ethics. But in a sense, like for example, in the example, some of the examples, for example, with the recruitment procedures, in which you have organizations which have, let's say, unfair recruitment procedures, and then you get an AI. They spend a lot of money on an AI system. The AI system is trained on their data. And then, of course, the AI system reflects some pretty bad biases. There was, for example, a famous experiment with Amazon. Just in case the Amazon lawyers, watch these recordings, we should point out they say they never use it for real, but nonetheless, there were bias that emerged, against women in the recruitment. So I guess my question is, isn't the danger that, in a sense, the AI bias become like a fig leaf for, let's say, bad organizational practices? And, isn't there a focus issue that, we should focus as much as on the human processes and structures, as much as on the AI algorithms, in order to have a meaningful discussion about ethics and bias and fairness, etc.?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. And I think I go back to the last thing I mentioned that it's very hard to have AI ethics if you don't have ethics. For example, if you have a company that fires the 2 people working on ethics and AI, that's an issue, right? Or if the same company tries to do an ethical board and fails, that happened with the same company, that's an issue. So I would say that yes, first we need to sort the house. That will take a long time. That will be more like justice, in the sense that that's not something that you can change from one day to the next. You need to change the culture of a company, and that's very hard. For example, today will be very hard to change, say, in all these multinational that when you say, okay, for example, what sometimes I think Zuckerberg said once, do until you break it. Well, but when breaking is an ethical issue, it's very hard to say, let's keep doing that. So the problem is that people is doing things without asking many questions that they should ask themselves, because first thing, they are not aware of these questions. So they don't know. They're young kids that even don't understand these black boxes they're using. And then even when they know the questions, their salary is on the line, right? They want to have a higher bonus or whatever. So this is the problem. I think we need to have more ethics in the culture of these companies to change everything.
Okay, that's great. So it's actually perfect time. It's exactly 5 p.m. So I think we can close it here. Ricardo, I would like to thank you, again, very much. It's been really great to have you here at the Open University, even virtually. Maybe next time we can see you physically in the lab in KMI. And also I'd like to thank Agnese for coordinating all of this and doing all the work. And everybody who turned up and asked the really interesting questions. So thank you very much, everybody.
Let me say hello to Stefan also. I saw at the beginning Miriam, so thank you for attending. So good friends.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. And
you.
so this series, Maven of the Month, will continue. So we will advertise the next event soon.